All right, I think we're good to go. Hi, hopefully everyone can see me, everyone can hear me, and it's such a pleasure to welcome you all at this webinar about the EPSO Administrators External Relations. This is András Baneth speaking live from Brussels, and I'm really proud that we are broadcasting for the very first time from our mini studio that we just assembled. So hopefully everything is going to go fine. Hopefully the audio quality, the video quality, everything is better than it used to be. So given all the close downs and the virtual nature of our life, we have decided to put this all together for your viewing pleasure and to make sure that the broadcast and the quality of our webcast has improved. So with that, I'd like to quickly welcome you all to the presentation and the live information session. Lenke and Veronica, my colleagues from Budapest, they are helping me remotely to make sure everything runs very smoothly. And they will be fielding questions to me, live feeding and filtering whatever question you might have. So please feel free to type that into the chat box and ask anything related to today's topic. And even if you have some questions afterwards, you can always send those questions to us, and my colleagues or myself will make sure to answer it as a follow-up. So with that, why don't you type into the chat box where you are dialing in from? This is our tradition of sorts. Make sure to be familiar with the chat box and how that works. So type that in, and I'm quickly peeking over my shoulder, and I see from Zurich, from Italy, from Brussels, from Denmark, from Canary Islands. Wow, lucky you. And literally from all over Europe and even beyond. Certainly some of you are placed even at other remote areas. You might already be involved in foreign affairs, external affairs, which is great and very helpful for the purposes of this competition. So with that, let's get started. A few housekeeping points. If there is any technical issue with the sound, that typically tends to be 99% of the challenges with technology. Usually, if you just restart your browser, that will solve it, or you open the webcast, the webinar in a different browser, that should fix it. There are even apps for Click Webinar on iPhone and Android. So you can certainly download those, type in the meeting room code, and then you'll be connected, and that should fix it. If not, my colleagues will be happy to help you. And in worst case, if the sound or the audio cuts off, you will be able to watch the recording. And that's my next point. Before introducing myself, which I won't bother you with much, as I'm involved with EU training for many, many years and dealing with EPSO affairs for quite a few years. But going back to the previous point, so in case you miss anything, you will receive all that I present to you right now, the full recording, which you might as well be watching this as a recording. But those of you present right now, you have certainly the benefit of asking questions live, which I'll be happy to take on and answer to the best of my abilities. With that, the slides as well will be shared with you in a more digestible format because the presentation version is slightly different, but you will get everything along with a full transcript of everything that I'm sharing with you right now. So a few words about ourselves and about EU training. You might be familiar with the services that we offer if you are trying to pass an EPSO competition for some time, but perhaps this is the very first time you're interested in an EU career and you came across our site from others. So far, over the almost 10 years we're in business, we have had 100,000 users, which is a very humbling number, and a great number of candidates have succeeded. Several hundreds, if not thousands of them are EU officials, which is something we're proud of, that we could help this community to flourish and to pass the competitions. Make sure that you follow us on Facebook. There are dedicated groups, and there's a main page that we're running as EU training. And then we offer a great number of test packages and preparation materials for you with a 25,000 plus question database available actually in 19 languages, something I'll come back to later on. And then we have over 17 million questions used, which is a pretty impressive number. And there are lots of webinars, over 100 hours of free and paid webinars, dedicated training materials on verbal reasoning to math refresher to the talent screener, which is another point I will come back to. So with that, I want to highlight that at the very end of today's live session, I'll be sharing with you a special exclusive offer, a special discount code that will give you access to almost all of our services, and you can take advantage of it for a very limited time. So that's part of the incentive for you to stay all the way, apart from getting valuable information. And I'll do my very best to engage you and talk to you as best as I can, despite the very geographically spread audience and despite the fact that there are lots of you today at this live event. So with that, again, just to emphasize, if you have questions, comments, please put that into the chat box, which I'm not seeing directly, but my colleagues will be filtering those and passing those in a secondary channel that I have right in front of me. So from time to time, I'll stop and try to answer a couple of the questions. Whatever question I may not have time to answer, I will make sure that we write a memo or some sort of a written material and we share that with you afterwards. So no question will be left unanswered. So let's get to it and let's look at the actual substance of this very competition. And perhaps the very first question when it comes to EU external relations and the position of an administrator in external relations is where you might end up working. Well, the very simple, easy, immediate answer is that you will work in Brussels at the European External Action Service, the EEAS, which is at the Schuman roundabout. There are nice restaurants nearby, and there's quite a busy life around it with many other EU institutions nearby. That's sort of the easy answer. The more complicated answer is that whether immediately or in the course of your career as an administrator in external relations, you will likely work for a certain amount of time at one of the EU delegations around the world. Just a bit of linguistic distinction or terminology distinction. We can talk about representations, which are EU representative offices in one of the 27 member states. And then you have delegations, which are in so-called third countries. Obviously, it's not third world countries, it's third countries meaning outside of the European Union. So even the UK EU representation has turned into a delegation, or perhaps it will turn into a delegation when the Brexit is done to some degree, but this is an ever-changing situation. So I don't know whether right now it's a representation or delegation, but if I had to guess, it's probably a delegation already. But for all other countries in the world outside of the EU, that's one of the delegations, 140. And it's not just countries that the EU has delegations at, but also international organizations like the WTO or United Nations and many others, and then specific countries or territories, which again is a question of international law, whether a certain area is recognized as a country or a territory or it has a special status. So you as an administrator can end up working in one of those or be on a mission or an assignment in one of those countries or one of those areas or one of those institutions. And thank you. I can peek over and I see that the EU, it's a delegation already. Thank you very much for pointing that out. So with that, it's a pretty exciting competition because you can deal with foreign affairs in so many ways, and you can deal with that in so many countries and places around the world. Obviously, that might include dangerous places, that might include controversial places, and that might include a host of other challenges and interesting areas. But that's part of the job and probably one of the key motivations why you are so interested in this kind of competition. So with that, you might ask, what are you going to do? Well, there's a range of issues that you might be doing, and it's very hard to say anything very specific or meaningful, but we collected certain things that you can see there. So you can help the EU's high representative achieve the foreign policy goals or carry out the EU's security and defense and policy and foreign policy. You could be dealing with promoting the EU's interests, which is a very broad thing, whether it's a value-driven, whether it's projects, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's local initiatives in a given country. It's really, really similar in many ways of being a diplomat and representing a country, which in the current case is pretty much representing the European Union's interest, which all of you dealing with foreign affairs would know is a highly complex and very political issue of getting the 27 EU member states come to common positions and a common political platform that you need to go out and represent towards third countries. But isn't that what makes it so exciting? And then as a third one, which all of this information we took from various EU sources, the Notice of Competition, EPSO, and the EEAS. So it's also cooperating with national diplomatic services. So the European External Action Service does not exist in a vacuum. It's really not a foreign office in a sense of a separate, unique, single foreign policy, but it's deeply embedded into the member states' foreign policy. And it's sort of the confluence of the 27 national priorities and how that translates into a common foreign and security policy. So that's pretty much what you will do on a day-to-day basis. This, as I said, can be project management. It can be dealing with political interlocutors, with local organizations, other ambassadors, coordination, and many other tasks. Given this competition, as with every EPSO competition, so competition for the selection of future European Union civil service staff, there is a fixed number of places that they foresee to have on the reserve list. So in this particular case, you have 53 and 33 places on the reserve list for so-called 85 and 87 positions. So 85 is pretty much the entry-level positions for those with a university degree. And then the 87 requires more work experience for you to demonstrate to be placed on a higher level administratively in terms of responsibilities and certainly in terms of salary. So this gives a rough indication of how many places will be, or it's more than an indication. This gives a specific number of the places there will be on the reserve list. And then from the reserve list, you will be recruitable to specific positions. Certainly, there are far more candidates than places, and that's why it's called a competition. So we'll look at the way the whole process develops, or the whole process needs to be followed in order for you to succeed and then realize your dream of becoming an EU official in this particular area. Deadline, 13th of October, which is not to be missed. Make sure that you send in your application at least a couple days before. We always say this. The servers might crash. There might be some personal challenges for you to get to your computer or whatever device you're going to file your application on. Make sure that you complete everything with sufficient forethought and sufficient attention to respect that deadline, because if you miss it, it's pretty much gone. And careful with time zones. So if you happen to be placed perhaps to the east of Brussels, this is Brussels time zone. So don't leave it for the last moment, because that might lead to all sorts of complications. So with that, perhaps the most important formal question is, are you eligible? Eligibility, as I said, is a formal criterion, or a set of criteria, actually, that we'll look at briefly. So if you don't meet those, you do not qualify for the competition. So it's fairly independent of your personal merits and how well you might perform at the competition. These are basic things, the basic criteria that you need to meet to be eligible. So there are general conditions. You certainly need to be an EU citizen. If you have dual citizenship, but at least one of them is an EU citizenship, lucky you, that's good, you qualify. Then the second one is to complete the military service. So in some countries, I believe in Greece, perhaps in Austria, it's compulsory military service. So you need to have completed it, or you need to have an official justification why you did not need to do it. And then the third one is you need to meet the character requirements required for the job. So if you have some criminal history or any sort of similar situation, you may not qualify. So you need to be sort of as a good ethical standing as an EU citizen. So that's pretty much the baseline, which is not particularly difficult to meet. And I believe most of the candidates would not have any issues with those. And then comes the second part, which is the languages. So you need to have a good command of at least 2 languages. These are called language 1 and language 2. Language 1 has to be one of the EU's 24 official languages. So that means you might be a fluent or native speaker of Luxembourgish, but Luxembourgish is not an EU official language, despite being widely spoken in Luxembourg and a little bit beyond. Or the same thing with Catalan, or the same thing perhaps with Russian. So these are widely spoken languages in Europe and in the EU itself, but these are not official languages. So it needs to be one of the 24 official languages, but it's your choice. It's entirely your choice which language you choose as a language one, as long as it's an EU official language. I'm Hungarian, I speak English, I speak French, I speak Spanish. I could choose any of these four as my language one. Now, my Spanish is a little rusty these days, so I certainly wouldn't choose that, but I could perhaps choose English, even though my mother tongue is truly Hungarian. So it's entirely up to you, and it's independent of your citizenship. So no matter what passport you might have, it's your choice which one you choose as language one. The general rule of thumb that I advise candidates to do is choose a language one with a language in which you can take in information the fastest. So perhaps passively, you can read text, you can analyze a verbal reasoning, a numerical reasoning exam, where you can read text pretty quickly. That's the one you should choose as language one. Because as you'll see, there's the language two, which must be English or French, and it has to be different from language one. So language two would be the language of the assessment center, and there you truly actively need to use that language. You need to speak at the competency-based interview. You need to write a little case study related to the field of the competition. So there you actively need to use the language. So for instance, my spoken French is pretty good, but my written French is not as sophisticated or elaborate as my English or my Hungarian. So again, this would be a consideration for me personally, but then again, given your situation, your linguistic knowledge, or how comfortable you are in each of these, and whether you have the luxury of actually choosing from some languages, that can impact your choice. But one thing for sure, so language one really can be any of the 24, and then language two, English or French, as long as it's different. So if you're a native English speaker and you might choose language one, then you're only left with German as language two. So with that, this I mentioned before. With that, you make that choice carefully and after analyzing it. But then again, it's a relatively easy part of the competition. And then you need to have certain qualifications, which is different for 85 and different for 87. For 85, as I said, it's an entry-level competition, but it's a so-called specialist competition. So the rules are a tiny bit different from the so-called generalist competitions, like the ones that EPSO often runs for public administration. In this particular case, they do require you 3 years of education, and you need to have 1 year of experience plus 1 year. So education plus 1 year of experience related to the field. So this is a little unique because normally for 85 competitions, they require no professional experience. But in this case, you need to have a professional 1 year professional experience related to external relations. Now, you might ask, and I will look at the questions in a second, I presume there will be a few questions, what qualifies as a professional experience? So if you worked in a foreign affairs ministry, that's a pretty straight situation. If you were perhaps a PhD researcher or just pursued studies in a certain field, I'm not entirely sure. This might be worth asking directly the selection panel, making sure that you do qualify and you're not going to be disqualified on the basis of that 1 year or more that may or may not be considered as a professional experience. As a main rule, the way they look at professional experience is that it needs to be a paid position. So if you were a volunteer in Vietnam or in Latin America for a year, as long as you were paid and it has truly to do with external relations, that could be justified and that could be accepted as such. But if you truly did, say, tracking in Latin America, well, lucky you, but probably that would not be considered as an external relations experience. So again, as long as it was a formal work relationship that was paid and you can justify all of that, that as a main rule would qualify as such. And again, here comes our legal disclaimer and our little caveat that whatever I tell you is really to the best of our knowledge, but the truly official information must come from the selection board or EPSO itself or any other official source, such as the notice of competition. So make sure that you double check whatever doubt you might have and make sure that you are fully covered from a legal perspective. When it comes to 87, 87 requires more experience. As I said, it will give you more responsibility once you get the job and certainly a higher salary. What does it require? And now I'm going to peek a little bit further to make sure that I'm not saying anything that may not be fully accurate. So you need to have 4 years of studies, as you can see on the screen. So 4 years of diploma plus a minimum of 6 years experience in external relations. Or there could be some flexibility there where you have only 3 years of studies, but then 7 years of experience. So studies and experience altogether needs to be at least 10 years, whether it's 4 and 6 or 3 and 7 is up to you, or basically how you pass those years, in which context you can present it in either way that I just described. So that's pretty much it in terms of the formal qualifications that you need to meet. And certainly you need to be able to prove it upon request. You need to be able to present the right documents and the right background information. And they might even require you to upload that into the system. They probably won't check it until much later into the process because simply the sheer number of candidates may not make it necessary to do it, because anyways, there will be some initial filtering, some pre-selection tests and exams, and only those who qualify for further rounds, it's only for those candidates that they will check these diplomas, work certificates, and the like. So that's pretty much it. I'll stop for a second. I see from the corner of my eyes that there are quite a few questions coming in. So let me look at my secondary device and see if there are questions I could answer for you. So here's one. For 85, only 53 will be taken. What minimum points do I need for the multiple choice test to have chances to pass to the assessment center? Well, we'll get to the actual tests in a second, and everybody will be then on the same page as to what kind of tests you need to pass. And then I'll come back to the idea of what scores you might need to get. But as a rule of thumb, whatever the maximum score is, if you can reach roughly 90% of those maximum points, let's say 85 to 90% of those maximum points, generally then you stand a good chance of passing on to the next stage. So that's sort of the ballpark of how well you need to perform. Given the competitive nature of these competitions, you truly need to be at the top of your game because there are a lot of candidates and you need to be among the best performing ones in each stage of the competition. Next one, if I don't fulfill all the criteria in the talent screener, do I still have a chance? I'm glad you brought up the talent screener. For those of you who may not know, we'll get to it in a second. So talent screener is a special questionnaire that you need to fill in. And we'll talk a little bit about what best practices you should apply to optimize your talent screener responses. And again, that's part of the process. We'll get back to it in a second. And then I've done a non-paid internship at the UN, even if it's not remunerated due to the nature of the institution. Would it count as a working experience? Now, that's a very good question that I would not feel comfortable answering with any certainty. So given that it's the UN, so it's probably extremely relevant for this position, but the fact that it was unpaid, that may put it in a different light. So this is the kind of question that I would encourage you to ask directly the selection panel, or there's a helpline, and make sure that they give you official information. Then perhaps the final question before I move on, and I know there are many others, but we'll get back to those in due course. So what is the difference in salary between the 85 and 87? Well, that's a good question. We actually have a salary calculator on eutraining.eu. You might want to check that out. Do not click on it yet. Stay with me. And after the webinar, you are more than welcome to check that out. But to answer that question, roughly it's about €1,000 of difference between 85 and 87. The 85 starting salary, depending on certain factors, whether you have children, whether you're married, whether you relocate from further away or you're already in Brussels for more than 6 months, the salary would be around 4,000, 4,500 net euros per month. And that also includes many other things that I will actually show you on screen. And the 87 would be about €1,000 more than that. So attractive salary, this I just mentioned, and you get health insurance. You have, if you have children, they can go to European schools in their respective languages, and there's quite a bit of infrastructure around it to make sure that your work in this international environment is as productive and as pleasant as possible. Now, here's a big question, which is probably on many of your minds, is how do you actually get these kind of jobs? Well, you need to pass the competition. You need to pass the different stages of the selection process. The application process is the one you see on the screen. So pretty much you declare your eligibility and make sure that you meet all the formal criteria that we have discussed. You need to pick the languages, language 1, language 2, and then the application needs to be submitted within the deadline, and you just basically get all these formalities and administrative parts done, which is pretty much the easy side. And then comes the talent screener. I mentioned before when I saw the question that the talent screener is part of this particular competition, as it is part of any other so-called specialist competition. So the talent screener is basically a set of questions, a questionnaire of sorts, which tries to explore your professional background and wants to know why you are suitable, eligible, relevant for that particular position. So they ask a lot of questions about your professional background, about your studies, about your views on certain matters, about your approach to certain problems and issues, but broadly, it's related to your professional path. They ask about your CV or resume for American speakers, and they ask anything that's related to your interests in the given field. So there are a lot of questions there, and then there are the assessors, so pretty much the selection board members, who will be reading through these answers, and they give you scores, give you certain points, and it's usually 0 to 3. So 0 means absolutely not relevant answers to a given question, and 3 is pretty much the maximum point you can get for a given question, and saying, okay, this person is exactly whom we're looking for in this particular area. So that's the talent screener, but it's something I'll come back to in a moment, because I've seen dozens, if not hundreds, of talent screener answers over the years. And candidates who are brilliant, they are really, really talented, and they have an excellent academic, professional background, often shoot themselves in the foot by not providing the answers in a way that would optimize their scores. So this is a topic I'll come back to in a few moments, because writing in a very clear, understandable, compelling, dare I say, persuasive manner in the talent screener has a major impact on the score that you will be given. So this is a topic I'm pretty fascinated about, because it relates really to persuasive writing. And despite talking about your own academic or professional background, you need to format that in a way that's easy to scan and quick to understand. You need to present that in a way that you highlight certain specific facts, information, so that the assessors will get a very clear idea of your achievements. Whereas many candidates tend to bury certain critical information in long sentences, in hard to read paragraphs, or just too much text that they answer as part of their talent screener. But point is, the talent screener is part of this particular competition because They are looking for those who are specialists in external relations. And you need to make that point. You need to make that case for yourself, given all the things you've done in your academic or professional life until now. So here it is. I just mentioned what the talent screener was, as you can see on the screen, and then how it's actually scored. I mentioned that briefly with the 0 to 3 points. Again, this is the main rule. So the little disclaimer is that there might be slight differences or changes. We don't expect these to happen in this particular competition, but there might be. So I'm telling you everything that we've seen so far and rumors that we're hearing. So pretty sure that it will stay the same. But then again, make sure to check the application when you see that on your computer screen. Make sure that everything is, whatever is written there, that's really the most up-to-date, accurate information. And then how do you maximize your score? So this is exactly what I was mentioning a moment ago, that you would want to certainly maximize your score because it's such an important part of the overall process. So here are a couple of tips. The first one is, well, try to be positive. And if they ask you a question, do you have experience dealing with, let's say, a local or national charity organization in a given country? Well, as long as you remain truthful, as long as you are really honest and ethical, and yet, or not yet, this is no contrast, but at the same time, I think that's a more accurate word to use. At the same time, you can frame or present an experience you had in a way that answers positively or in the affirmative to that given question. In that case, you should do that. So think about whatever experience you may have had. Can you present that it will answer, that it will be relevant to that particular question? Because simply putting something there, no, I don't have that kind of experience, well, immediately you're going to get 0 points. So I'm really emphasizing you need to be truthful and you need to really rely on your own experience and not distort any information. At the same time, try to approach that with that sort of mindset of, did that project that I did in somewhere in Eastern Europe, does that qualify, and can I present that in a way that this question requires me to do? And then the next tip is be very concrete. This is such a simple thing to do, and yet so many candidates just fail to keep that in mind. I'll give you a silly example, perhaps. You say, well, I worked on many international projects in a range of countries in Asia. I said almost nothing with this sentence. You didn't mention how many countries you worked in. You didn't mention examples of the countries you worked in. You didn't say anything about the budget of those projects or the scale, how many people were involved. You didn't talk anything about the impact of that particular project. There are so many concrete, specific things you could add to indicate the scale, the importance, your personal responsibility, the task that you took on. All of this you can bring in a very concrete manner. So it's a simple exercise just to go through your answers and make sure that you're very specific in those, because that's exactly what can resonate with the assessors and that impact your scores. Here's another one. Let me peek behind my screen. Yes, providing a lot of variable information. So this is very similar to the previous one where you want to give examples. You want to make sure that you demonstrate whatever you claim and you underline, you bring in the proof points of what you just claimed as an experience. And then do not copy paste previous answers. I've seen many candidates when there are lots of questions in the talent screener, out of laziness or comfortability or just lack of imagination, they would copy paste earlier answers and say, well, this is what I did. And just as I indicated in question 3, I actually want to say the same thing here. No, present information always in the most relevant way. And even if it's some sort of duplication, you want to rephrase it or just take a different angle on the same matter. This has an impact on your scores. So this is a crucial part of you optimizing your talent screener responses. And then readability and just a clear visual presentation, the layout of your talent screener matters. So I've seen talent screeners with extremely long run-on sentences. I've seen those where paragraphs were just simply not broken into subparagraphs. You could even add little titles, or you can add numbers, or you can add bullet points, even without any true formatting as we would know it in a Google Docs or Microsoft Word or any other. You can do it even in a simple plain text format, just to help the reader scan and understand whatever you're presenting. And you might think, well, my achievements speak for themselves. Well, often they don't. Often when a talent screener, when an assessor has to read dozens, if not hundreds of talent screeners in a given day, well, their eyes will just glaze over, and that might impact your scores. So you want to make sure that you help their job, help them understand your achievements as best as possible. And then EU institutions and also EPSO, the Personal Selection Office, they are pretty formal. They like, to some degree, their jargon. They like their terminology. They like to talk about the EU programs. So whenever there is a link between your achievements or your background and what the EU does or the External Action Service does, you might want to highlight that, and you might want to replicate that language and that choice of vocabulary, again, to provide that positive impression, which you might otherwise not think of. And then what's my next point? Oh, there we go. So what's in it for them? This is, again, a pretty typical concept in any persuasive writing, from marketing to cover letters for job applications, all the way to the talent screener. Well, you want to say what you can contribute to the work of the European External Action Service and the European Union in particular with your background, with your achievements. So what is it that you bring to them, and not just saying these are the fantastic achievements that I can present, but connect that with the kind of things that they care about. So to say, well, I have 5 years of experience dealing with conflict resolution in very challenging conflict zones, and this can be a relevant experience given the EU's engagement or commitment in the following areas. So you not only state something, but you connect that very concretely to how that is going to be good for your, hopefully, future employer. And then with that, perhaps the final point is that we actually have a webinar where some of these points that I've just described you will hear, but there's far more to it. And I show a lot of examples and very specific ideas that you can apply in the talent screener. So if you're interested in this topic in a more in-depth manner, then feel free to check out the talent screener webinar that we have available on our website. So with that, let me pause for another second before I go to the computer-based test. And I see that there are a couple of other questions coming in. So should the university degree be related to the field? There is no requirement in the notice of competition that your university degree needs to be related to the field, which is pretty understandable to my mind, given that external relations, it's a vast area. You could be a lawyer, an economist, a development expert, a conflict resolution person, a psychologist. You could be a sustainable agriculture expert. There are so many fields which broadly can relate to external relations. So I agree that this makes actually sense, and in a formal way or in a formal approach, there's no such requirement in the notice of competition. It's your experience that needs to be related to the field, related to external relations. Another question, can UK citizens apply? Unfortunately, no. So UK is no longer member of the EU. So we're talking about EU 27. So UK citizens are not eligible because they are not among the 27 EU member countries. Then, if I got a degree in international relations, can I apply to the European law administrators, or can I just apply to external relations? I was wondering if I could apply to both. I'll address this question, though it's slightly specific, but there's a broader point I'd like to make. Generally, for EPSO competitions, you can apply to as many as you like. In parallel, you can sign up for all these competitions, unless there's a very concrete clause in the notice of competition saying those who apply for so-and-so exams cannot apply for this one as well. But this is extremely rare. So the main rule is you can have 3, 4, 5, any number of applications running in parallel as long as you meet all the formal criteria. So in this particular case, the person asking the question, well, if you have a legal degree or a degree in law, then you should be able to qualify both for the external relations and the EU 85 law exam, which happens to be ongoing right now. And that applies to everyone else. As long as you meet those formal criteria or you have the right degree, then you can apply for any number of competitions in parallel. And it might be even a good thing because you can practice the computer-based test, you can practice certain parts of the exam, and that can help your performance. I know there are many other questions. We'll cut back to those, but I'd like to, in respect of everyone's time, go on with the presentation. So with that, the computer-based tests, the so-called pre-selection exam, often referred to as a CBT exam, which is computer-based tests. And this typically includes so-called verbal, abstract, and numerical reasoning tests. These take place at a test center, and these are all over Europe. So you can book an exam date when you are notified by EPSO, follow the link, follow this particular website and book the exam time. And then you basically go to a test center, you sit in front of a computer, and then you need to take these tests. Now, one word given where we are today, 11th of September 2020, where many countries, many institutions are closed and there are severe restrictions in terms of where you can go or movement. So what we're hearing is that EPSO is exploring different ways of taking some of these tests, perhaps from the comfort of your home in front of your computer, or perhaps some alternative way that we don't yet know how they're going to do it. But given those restrictions, there might be some changes as to where you can take those tests. But the substance, the very nature of these tests is almost certainly going to stay exactly the same as we know it. So with that, pre-selection exam with abstract, verbal, numerical reasoning, what does that look like? Many of you would be pretty familiar with these tests, and certainly you can take a lot of those on our website, and also EPSO offers a couple of practice tests. The verbal reasoning is a fairly straightforward kind of exercise. You have 35 minutes and 20 questions where you need to answer or actually pick the right answer from multiple options. So you have a text passage. You need to analyze it very quickly, because if you look at the timing, you see how little time you have for that, and then choose the most accurate answer from the different options that are offered to you. So this is sort of a verbal reasoning, not so much a reading comprehension. So there's a bit of logical element to it where you need to deduct, you need to a little bit analyze the text and not just simply look at a synonym or look at the linguistic meaning of a given sentence. There is more analysis to this kind of exercise. So this is one test that you need to sit in language one. So that's why my earlier comment, choose a language one in which you can quickly read and process information so you can perform well at this particular exam. Another one is the numerical reasoning, where you have a chart, a table often, that you need to look at the different cells, the different connotation between the various numbers and figures, analyze it, and do pretty much an algebra operations and calculate, and then come up with the correct answer from the multiple options. The best thing to do here is that you do mental calculations and you don't necessarily use the calculator. And by the way, you are given an on-screen calculator, so that certainly helps your job, but it takes time. So if you can estimate, you can guesstimate, you can get proportions right, pretty quickly you can find the correct answer. So numerical reasoning, just like verbal reasoning, and to some degree the abstract reasoning, is not that difficult if you have time. But given the time pressure, that's what makes it so difficult. And that's why it requires a lot of practice, a bit like any sport or any sport that is being timed, that most people in good physical health can run 100 meters, but they cannot necessarily do that under 10 seconds. So for that, you need massive, massive preparation. Similar in these kind of competitions, that speed is of the essence, and certainly accuracy is just as important. Then you have the abstract reasoning, where you see this kind of charts on the screen, and you need to find out which one is next in the sequence, which one is next in the series. And again, with a bit of time, most candidates can actually find the correct answer, but here you have 10 minutes and 10 questions. So 1 minute is a pretty difficult, pretty challenging time to respect. So with that, you see the different pass marks. Why are pass marks important? So you have a so-called objective pass mark. So that's independent of any other candidate. You need to have those minimal threshold in order to pass. And then you have the relative pass mark, which is compared to other candidates. And this is the question that we had earlier. What score should you get to secure your place at the next phase of the competition? And that's where I answered roughly 85 to 90% of the overall achievable score will likely get you to the next stage. So the objective pass mark is less relevant from that perspective. It's really against the other candidates that you need to compete. So you see on the screen, for the verbal reasoning, you need to get 10 points out of 20, pretty achievable bar to jump. And then you have the verbal and the abstract with a combined score of having 8 out of 20 in those two together. So you can be fairly underperforming at the abstract reasoning, and you can be a star in numerical reasoning, and you can still get a pretty high score. But then one might wonder whether you are among the top scoring candidates if you compare your score to all the others. So that's the pre-selection test. And as I said, pass mark is not enough. You really need to achieve a very high score to be successful and get to the next stage. So then comes the talent screener review. So the talent screener will not be reviewed until that point. So only if you pass to the next stage and you sort of proved your talents in the abstract verbal numerical reasoning, only then will they start checking your talent screener and giving you scores based on those many factors that I've already covered, and making sure that your answers are truly optimized. And then if all goes well, you have the assessment center. Again, given the times we live in, assessment center used to be in Brussels, and I use the term used to be because even though there is the nice building on Avenue Kortenberg, and EPSO has all the facilities there, and for many years now, they've been receiving hundreds and thousands of candidates going through the assessment center. But right now, given all the restrictions, it seems that assessment center will happen online. The content of many of these exercises will probably not change, save for some others. So doing perhaps a group exercise, or as it's called, what is it called? Role play. Yes, that's the word I was looking for. A role play exercise, that might be a very different dynamic if everyone is on a computer screen, and those Zoom calls or WebEx calls or Microsoft Teams calls, how that's going to work, we don't yet know. But still, there are a lot of things to say about it and how you can optimize your performance, from your body language to reading a document on screen and then saying meaningful things, and the group interaction, how that might happen. That is still, there is some system to it. There is a method to it, something that you can learn and something you can train for. But right now, at least according to the notice of competition, this will happen in Brussels. Again, we don't know that by the time that this competition gets to the assessment center stage, hopefully things will be far better. Hopefully travel restrictions will be eased. Hopefully this will indeed happen in Brussels. But be prepared that this might actually happen in a virtual setting through your computer, or you might need to go to the test center, and then they provide the IT facilities, and then you need to do that in a more virtual setting. And the assessment center is done in language 2, hence my earlier comment that you need to master that language and pick a language 2 in which you can express yourself to the best of your abilities. And the type of test that you have a case study exam, and the case study is not related to the field. So it's not about external relations. What is about the external relations is on the right end of the screen. So a written test in the field. So case study and written test in the field are two separate things. The case study looks at your competencies of analyzing, of quickly processing information, of writing properly. And then the written test in the field is truly linked to your field of expertise, which is external relations. And then you have the group exercise, which again, as I said, it might be a virtual one, and we don't yet know how that might be changed or adapted to the lack of physical presence. And then a competency-based interview that can easily be done online. It's pretty much like a Skype interview where perhaps two assessors are sitting on one side and you in front of your screen and asking you questions related to your resiliency, your working with other skills, your leadership competencies, and all the other 8 competencies that EPSO wants to test. And then you also have the interview in the field and the competency-based interview. Competency-based interview is the one I just mentioned, but the interview in the field is exactly looking for topics very close to what the talent screener was asking you about. So your professional background and linked to your academic experience, and then again, professional experience. And they will ask you questions on how did you get to that position? What was your experience there? And they might even ask you questions like, how would you approach a situation like this? Sort of these hypothetical questions as well. So that's the assessment center. It typically takes place on the same day, except for the case study. But then again, if that is converted to some sort of an online / virtual environment with the test center, there might be adaptations. So that is something pending. But by the time you get there, we will have far more information about this. So you needn't worry about this at this stage, because as you saw earlier, this is the second phase of this particular competition. And then you have the points, the scoring that you see on the screen. So you have the competencies, 8 competencies, each worth 10. So altogether 80, and you need to have at least 40 points. And then you have the other, which is your professional side, where the interview in the field and the written test, that is worth a lot of points as well, altogether 100. And you need to have at least 50 for those two in order to pass. So in a nutshell, or perhaps a big nutshell, that's pretty much it. And if everything goes well, and why wouldn't it, you get on the reserve list. And once you are on the reserve list, you can be recruited by, well, normally any EU institution, but given this particular one, by the European External Action Service, or perhaps even by one of the delegations. But in legal terms, the delegations are under the supervision of the European External Action Service. So even in that case, you would probably be hired by the EEAS, though there are some non-EEAS staff in delegations as well, but we won't go into those details. So the reserve list itself has a validity. It's typically 1 year, though in some cases they might extend it. And in other cases, it's even valid for a longer time until a similar competition of the same kind is announced. So in this case, it's probably going to be valid for perhaps 2 or 3 years or even longer, though the aim of the institutions and probably your professional aim is to be hired as soon as possible. And then again, a little plug for one of our webinars. There is one called How to Get a Job Once You're on the Reserve List. So when you are at that stage, make sure to check it out. And that hopefully gives you some good pieces of advice. So with that, how to get the job? Well, a few ideas. Practice a lot, depending on where you are right now in terms of your abilities of verbal, abstract, numerical reasoning and your general understanding of the competitions. Prepare regularly. If it's 1 hour per day or multiple times during a week, as long as it's regular, really look at it like a sports preparation where regularity is really important. And if you do that, according to a sound methodology, that will help you a great deal. So do not reinvent the wheel. There are enormous amounts of materials we put on our site, free ebooks, free webinars, tips and tricks articles, and our customer support is there to help you and guide you and point you to the right resource. So use that methodology because it will save you time and make you more effective. And then persistence. So you might want to create a little study group. You might want to talk with some friends and prepare together, but be very consistent and persistent in that, and do lots of simulations as part of your preparation. So with that, we are here to help you. We're here to provide all the materials and check out all the resources we make available. You have lots and lots of simulation tests, as I mentioned, and one of our proudest achievements is that we have verbal reasoning in 19 languages. So perhaps almost all of your languages are covered. I know there are 5 more missing from the official EU languages, but we're even working on those. So you can find verbal reasoning from Portuguese to Romanian to Italian to Greek to Swedish, almost all the languages that we could develop. So you can practice in your language one and do realistic simulations. And then the webinars are out there. There are some free webinars and some premium ones. Depending on the topic, you should be able to find those resources very easily. And we even offer personal coaching, whether it's in person or through Skype or any other channel. That is entirely available for you, apart from in-person training here in Brussels at our training center. And then online, all the webinars and other resources are made available. So with that, join the Facebook group and talk with your peers and share rumors and news and updates. So there is that Facebook group that you see on the screen. And perhaps you're interested in my book, the Ultimate EU Test Book, with different editions. The 2020 was published a couple of months ago. It's already available. And then the special discount, I will leave that on the screen while I peek at my phone to see the other questions that have come in since. And I can answer those while you are contemplating this unique offer. So with that, could you advise on study sources for the interview in the field? Yes, generally I recommend 2 pretty good sources. And again, as a broad idea, not necessarily just for external affairs or external relations, typically annual reports of an institution or directorate general or a service, as in the case of the EEAS. Annual reports tend to be pretty helpful sources for preparation, because there they really summarize everything that they've done in the most recent year or whenever the annual report is available. And that helps you get pretty much up to speed of what their political and policy priorities are. So you might want to look at those and say, okay, these are probably issues that they're most concerned about. And that brings you up to speed. It helps you with the vocabulary, with the jargon, and all the major things and achievements that they consider worthy of publication. Another pretty good source tend to be press releases. So press releases, again, brings you up to date on the most important issues and challenges that an institution faces. So for EEAS, these are the kind of things you might want to look at. And then there are other pretty good sources. The European Parliament tends to publish very good summaries and good materials, even on foreign policy. There's the European Parliament Research Service. So that's something you might want to look at, whether they have some helpful reports on certain aspects. And then, of course, EEAS has a wealth of information from different countries and regions, and political declarations and speeches. All of this you can look at. And then you might want to look at some academic literature, whether it's certain textbooks or other major publications. Now, I don't know whether you have the time or the energy to really go through those, but if you're preparing for the interview in the field, you probably want to take that seriously. Depending on what your background is, you may need more reading than others who might be actively working in the area already. And then with that, maybe 1 or 2 questions before we finish. I've recently passed the computer-based tests. Do I have to pass them again? Well, thank you for asking this question, because I presume this is on the minds of quite a few candidates. This, unfortunately, you need to pass that again. This is not like a language exam or some other certificate where you need to pass it once and then you kind of retain the scores. And even a similar situation happens in the so-called CAST exams, which is contract agent exams. Some of you might be familiar with that. But in this particular case, for every EPSO run open competition, you need to pass the computer-based test each and every time. So you probably are more experienced if you've passed already computer-based tests. Good for you, keep practicing, and it will probably be easier for you to reach a good score in this exam, but you do need to pass that again. What else? And then one of the requirements of this position is to agree to be posted in conflict-prone regions in the world. Does the EAS consider family situations to post the applicants? I presume so. I don't really think that they would kind of oblige you to go, I don't know, to Afghanistan or war zones or conflict zones without your consent, or at least saying, well, this is the only option we have, take it or leave it. So I doubt that this would be the case. So they certainly will listen to your input. So if you have children, or especially young children, they are less likely to offer you that sort of position. And of course, there's a lot of factors that go into it, whether where is a vacancy, where can they offer you a position, what is your experience, because maybe you're extremely trained in conflict resolution, so they say, well, you are actually the ideal candidate for us to post in that area, will you take it? But at any given point, there are lots of opportunities in the EEAS family, so I'm pretty sure that there will be opportunities with that you can sort of negotiate and you can discuss with them directly. But you certainly need to be ready to be posted at such places at one point in your career, because, well, we know the world is not just shiny, happy, peaceful peoples living all together. Well, that's part of foreign policy, where you need to be ready to engage in that sort of job. But this is not something a love it or what is it, take it or leave it situation in any case. So perhaps a final question, and I know our time is pretty much up. I missed the first part of this webinar. Will a recording of this webinar be available later on? Absolutely. As we mentioned before, there is the recording coming your way with a transcript, with the slides, with everything there is. And this is probably a good moment for me to conclude. And thank you so much for your attention. A big thanks to Veronica and Lenke for helping me put this all together and being in the background, making sure everything runs very smoothly. A big thanks to Esther, who helped me put our little studio together. And hopefully you enjoyed it and the audio video quality was better than ever before. And with that, do reach out to us, send us messages if we can be helpful with anything, if we can guide you or point you to the right resource or the right area or the right person to talk to with your questions. And EU Training is really here to help you succeed and pass the competition and realize your dream of becoming an EU official and work in external relations. So thank you so much for being here. Share the webinar and all the resources with your friends and your network. We'll be forever grateful. And let us know what other services or ideas we can be helpful with to help you succeed in the competitions. So thank you. This is András Baneth from Brussels, and hope to see you next time.